those of you online, can you hear us? You can chat. You can type in the chat box and introduce yourself, and then also answer the poll questions if you haven't had a chance to yet. My name is Abby Love, and I am the Agriculture Officer for the TOPS program, stands for Technical and Operational Performance Support. If you aren't familiar with it, it's a USA exclusively funded knowledge management capacity building grant. And today we are here with a small grant recipient. So the TOPS program has a small grants program that throughout the life of TOPS we've been giving out $50,000 or $100,000 grants to explore a research topic or to investigate a question or test a method or tool. And so World Vision received a small grant from us and has been investigating demonstration sites and kind of what guidelines can we put together for improving the management of those demonstration sites. And so today we have Gitao Mure, the Senior Technical Advisor for Agriculture at World Vision, here in the room in DC. And then joining us online, we have Claire Sullivan, who's the Deputy Ag and Food Security Center at Columbia University. And so I will just go ahead and pass it off to Gitao to get us started.
Thanks, Abby. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. As Abby mentioned, my role at World Vision, I'm a technical advisor for agriculture, and I've been leading this study, working with Claire and a few of my colleagues. So I'm going to start just going over the questions, those opening queries. So we posed 3 questions, and I see that there's a clear trend on question number 1, where we're asking what percentage of food security programs feature demos attention to. So since most people feel 50 to 75%, and that's probably true, although I'd say from our assessment, I think we did not find a food security program that did not have a demonstration site. So I would put that at 75 to 100%. And then the second question is what percentage of demos set up on security programs fail each year? So there's 2 people who said 50% to 75%, and then 2 people 25 to 50%. So that's split evenly. And that really depends on what's going on. So if there's a shock, if there's a drought or flooding, then you have that rate going up to 75 to 100%. But on average, I think you're looking at anywhere from about 25 to 50%. And then the last question, that question was, should demos have signboards for marking and branding? And it's a bit of a controversial issue. I think some implementers understand that USAID requires that signboard. It's not clear whether that's a directive from USAID. And some people have very strong opinions that if you put a signboard, then you're really taking away the ownership of that demo from the community, and it's not sustainable. So I don't think there's a right answer. I think it really depends on the context, but it's also something that we as implementers should be exploring a bit more with the donor and also with the. So those were just some questions to get us excited about the topic. So the way we'll go about the presentation today, I will start and take us almost halfway. And then my colleague Claire, who's joining us online, will take us for the second half. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the study that we did. As Abby mentioned, we received Program Improvement Grant Award from TOPS. And the idea is to develop guidelines to be used to improve the management of agriculture demonstration sites. So we did this by assessing prevailing practices across programs in Bangladesh, Niger, and Zimbabwe, partly because World Vision has programs in these 3 countries, but also because we felt they are a good representation of different contexts Bangladesh, Niger, and Zimbabwe are pretty different in terms of farming systems. So we felt they'd give us a good idea of how implementers are doing. So the goal is to identify what are the key constraints, what are the lessons learned, and what are some of the best practices, and then come up with recommendations for implementing. The methodology was we collected data mainly through key informant and focus group discussions. Key informant interviews were done with program staff and their partners, including government and private sector in the 3 countries. We also did phone interviews with program support staff, mostly in Washington, D.C. These are organizations who have food security programs and may have a technical advisor for food security or agriculture. So we got to speak to quite a number of those. And we also spoke with beneficiaries. We did focus group discussions in all 3 countries with communities that have participated in demonstration sites. So that's just a count. I think we ended up with about 31 focus group discussions, 38 key informant interviews spread in countries. So in terms of where we are, right now we are finalizing the publication. It's in draft form. And we felt it was important to take an opportunity before we publish, present the main findings, and solicit feedback on the appropriateness of the guidelines, and also if there's any gaps or any issues, relevant issues that we may have missed. The goal is to put together a publication of the guidelines, guiding principles for management of demos and food security programs. We'll also come up with an assessment tool. So let's say you're an implementer and you have lots of demos and you'd like to know where do you stand in terms of what the guiding principles say. So where do you need to make adjustments? We'll put together a tool for that once we finalize that. We're also hoping to compile resources that practitioners can use for informing the management of it. So the target audience is program staff working on food security programs. And today we'll pretty much have 2 goals. One is to share the main findings, and then just give you an opportunity to react the findings and presentations. We do hope to have the publication finalized by the end of this month, and then after that we will disseminate that publication, maybe even have a future presentation just to create a benefit. So the presentation today is kind of in 3 parts. We'll do the presentation, myself and Claire, just going through those topics. And then we'll have the group exercise where people will get to talk about their own experience, their program, and see how these recommendations fit in. And then we'll also have some time for Q&A. And just before I start, I think what we can do, if there are any burning questions, maybe before I hand over to Claire, kind of halfway through, we can talk, maybe just have about 5 minutes of discussion, if any burning questions. And then we'll save most of the questions for when we finish the once we're doing the So just to start by defining demonstration sites. There is a huge variation in terms of what people understand by demonstration sites. So some people call them field demos, demonstration sites. There's even some confusion with trials. There's a lot of research organizations that work with implementers, and they do trials, and some people see those as demos. But for us, I think the way we define a demonstration site, it kind of has 2 angles to it. One angle is the seeing is believing part. So there has to be an element of showcasing a new practice. And ideally that practice needs to be a proven practice, not a practice or technology that's trial. We also defined a demo as a site that is put together for learning purposes. There's a knowledge transfer element to it. And it has to be learning by doing. provides an opportunity for farmers to try out that proven technology. It might be proven in other places, and they need to see how it works. But we did consider demos to not just be crop demos. They can also be livestock demos, also aquaculture. So in terms of significance of demos, I think the importance of demos can be evident just by how many demos there are out there and how many farmers depend on these demos. This table here shows the programs that we reviewed in Bangladesh. And as you can see, there's about 6,800 demos implemented across 7 programs, reaching about 2.2 million farmers. And then in Niger, there was about 1,300 demos, reaching over 434,000 farmers across 3 programs. And a slightly smaller number of demos in Zimbabwe, 964 across 3 programs. And again, reaching about 100,000 farmers. And one thing we understood is that demos are very common, and they are a key part of agriculture. I think outside of farmer field schools, demos are probably the next most prominent feature of agriculture extension system. So in terms of the types of demos you find out there, there's a huge variation depending on the context. The assessment was done during the winter season in Bangladesh. So most of the demos that we saw were vegetable demos. We also saw some composite demos where they tried to combine aquaculture, horticulture, and also block demos, an idea where you have a lot of farmers in a specific community coming together and joining their contiguous pieces of land to create kind of a huge demo. Sometimes they do it for seed multiplication, and sometimes they just do it to create kind of a bigger visual effect to show that many people are actually practicing this particular technology. In Niger, the assessment was done during off-season for demos, so most of the demos we saw were around agroforestry, FMNR, which stands for Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, and those are kind of like all-season demos. There's also private sector demos in Niger done between implementers of food security programs, a seed supply company, and village agents. So the village agents are kind of liaisons working with the private sector company to promote a certain variety. They're setting up demos as well. And then in Zimbabwe, we were there during the main cropping season. We found that there's a lot of commercial demos. The private sector, the seed companies in Zimbabwe are very active in promoting demos. In fact, if you drive around Zimbabwe during the main cropping season, you'll find a lot of maize demos. It's a vibrant maize seed market, so there's a lot of those kind of demos. There's also baby demos and mother demos in Zimbabwe, and we've seen this elsewhere. And the idea behind that is you have a mother demo, which is used to train lead farmers coming from different villages, and then they go back and set up baby demos. So that was kind of something that's a unique focus in Zimbabwe. In terms of the practices shown on demos, they vary as well. As you can see, there's quite a number. Very common to find conservation agriculture demos, and improved seed variety demos, and also soil fertility. So I'll talk briefly about why demos are so popular. I think for us, we came up with 5 reasons. One is that demos are popular because it's a way for farmers to witness firsthand the value and the performance of that particular technology. So that is very powerful because once farmers see something, they're more likely to believe that it's possible, that technology can be different. It also, as we said, gives an opportunity for farmers to learn by doing. They can learn in the process, they can make adjustments to fit their context. It's also a risk management tool for farmers. They can try something on a small area, and then before they expand it, so they don't have to take the risk, they can actually have someone else try it and see how it works before they try it on their own farm. Also, in terms of scale, we find that implementers like Demos because you can reach large numbers of farmers through Demos. Demos are usually targeted to farmer groups, but they are also targeted to farmers in that area who may not be formally registered in a group. Most of the times they'll be by the roadside, so the idea is that we can reach a lot of farmers and have them buy into that technology. And then there seems to be a long tradition of using them. As far as like the early 1900s, we find that demos have been used in ag extension for a long time. And so it's almost like automatic thinking. It's like, how can you do ag extension without doing demos? So those are the reasons why we feel demos are so popular, but I'm sure the people may have different reasons depending on their context. However, there are lots of concerns about demos as well, and we did interviews just trying to get people's opinions about demos, and we found captured a number of key concerns. One of them is practitioners especially feel that demos tend to take a top-down approach. So you have a technology that's been proven mainly through research elsewhere or even in that country. And the idea is that a development program is trying to introduce that into the community. You don't find too many demos that are generated from ideas that come from that community. People also question the sustainability of demos. So we tend to see that farmers are excited about a practice once the program is running. But once the program ends, there seems to be a lack of continuity in adoption of that particular practice. And then in terms of engagement of private sector, that is not always very strong, especially on food security programs. And by food security programs, I'm talking about programs mainly funded by Food for Peace, but also Feed the Future programs as well. Most of these programs are targeting vulnerable households, and the engagement of private sector is not always very strong. I think I've talked about automatic thinking and demos being seen as the default strategy. There's also a push to have to use demos to meet targets. So sometimes there's unrealistic high numbers of beneficiaries targeted, and the one way to say that we train them is to use demos. And in that case, you find that maybe quantity is compromising the quality of demos. Poor presentation is actually part of the reason why we got interested in this study. We found that if you visit demos, many times you find that they fail to show a clear advantage of using that promoted practice. There's also concerns about credibility, and people feel like demos kind of cherry pick farmers and locations, and they don't really represent the real conditions that smallholder farmers may be facing. Farmers' concerns are centered mostly around poor implementation and lack of support. Farmers feel like they don't get adequate support to move from the demonstration, one, to set up the demonstration, and also to take that particular technology from the demonstration into and scale it up the rest of their farms. They also feel like the uptake by neighboring farmers, there's challenges there. A lot of these have to do with behavior change and other factors that may determine whether farmers buy into a technology or not. Climatic shocks and stresses, drought, flood, pests, and diseases are a big constraint when it comes to implementing quality demos. And sometimes we find that there's a lack of clear objectives. There's a big distinction between dissemination of proven practices and the trials or the research. So it's not always clear, and if it's a trial, some people might think it's a demonstration for dissemination, and if it fails, it may send mixed messages. And then there's generally just a lack of reference material from the subject. So what we did is, after reviewing these perceptions and doing key informant interviews and focus group discussions, we synthesized all this information and tried to ask ourselves, what kind of guidance can we offer to implementers through the process? And we arrived at 7 guiding principles. So I'll go through 3 of those principles, and then my colleague Claire is going to go through the other 4. So principle number 1 has to do with design and planning. And here we are asking ourselves, what is the process and of decision making around deciding whether demos are needed, what kind of demos are needed, how many demos should we establish, what should be the selection criteria of farmers, what should be the criteria for selecting locations, and what kind of resources are we going to need in order to implement demos. So we found that in most cases, demos as an idea are included in proposals. There may be pre-design assessments done. So before an implementer designs a program, they'll talk to stakeholders. And in most cases, they'll find that demos are already an existing technology. So the idea there will be it's a foundation that's already set or a trend that's already set that we can build on. But there's little evidence to show that assessments are done to evaluate the necessity. People don't necessarily question whether we should be doing demos. And maybe might even take more effort to convince people that we don't need demos, or even to understand the constraints and the opportunities of demos as they stand. So there's kind of the automatic thinking again. It's a tradition. We'll continue doing this without really applying evaluative thinking. Farmers obviously say that the idea of doing demos mostly comes from programs. They come from the NGO implementing the program or from the government. Sometimes a combination of both. And the targets for the types and the number of demos are usually very rough estimates. So in terms of the decisions that are being made, we find that implementers may rely on advice from researchers. It's very common to find NGOs working with TG centers or sometimes with National Agricultural Research Institutes. They may provide guidance in terms of the layout, in terms of the treatment, but the selection of practices to be promoted is usually done in consultation. Program staff will consult with government, in some cases with private sector and extension service providers. The number of demos and size will be implemented by implementers, and that's really, really dependent on budget. It's amazing because people come up with budgets at the beginning of the program, and then that now determines how many demos they can do, and prices of demos and materials that's going to demo, the level of support can change, so that number can vary over time. So in terms of like kind of the design, what we found to be some of the best practices is piloting. We found some instances where implementers were piloting, starting with a small set of demos, and then gathering evidence before launching a bigger program of demos in the second or in the third year. In Zimbabwe, they also had an approach where they used the master demos, the mother demos. They used those to train farmers how to set up demos, but ultimately farmers can pick and choose what they want to get from the mother demo or from the master demo, and then they can use the evidence gained there to set up their own demos, which we're calling baby demos. In Zimbabwe, there was also another example with an organization called Christian Care. They train farmers to do demos. They work with farmer groups, and instead of having a lead farmer who does the demo, they train every farmer on the idea of doing a demo, and every farmer is actually encouraged to set up their own demo. So that works fairly well, but I think it only works in cases where the technology does not require a lot of external support. So with things like conservation agriculture, where farmers have to do mulching and maybe intercropping, those kind of things, it's very easy to convince every farmer to set up their own demo. It may not work very well if the technology requires a lot of external. So another factor is selection of host farmers. And we found that in most cases there isn't written criteria. It's usually done in consultation between program staff, the government extension agents, and local leaders. Part of it is bias because they prefer to have demos by the roadside, and so not every farmer is going to have a piece of land by the roadside. So even though they may come up with criteria that seems a bit objective, once they state that they prefer to have demos by the roadside, then that kind of introduces a certain bias selection of courses. The most common thing is that people are looking for a progressive farmer. It's not always clear what a progressive farmer is, but I think the idea is somebody who is seen as a trendsetter in that community, someone who's already practicing improved agriculture practices. In most cases, programs are also looking for people who are willing to contribute towards the cost of implementing the demo, farmers who can also teach others. Community leaders play an important role here. They provide paroles to program staff and to government extension agents, or who would be a good host. Basically, the recommendations here that we have are twofold. One, the objectivity of the selection of host farmers is very, very important. And we found that people are not paying enough attention to that and also making that very clear. So it can vary on different areas if it's not written and if it's not agreed upon. So we are recommending that implementers really need to gather stakeholders together and make sure that there's a consistent and clear process that involves farmers. There's also need to leverage positive deviance, and by positive deviance we mean farmers in that area who may not be proposed as lead farmers, but who are actually practicing particular improved farming technology under very limited resource conditions. And sometimes programs have to go out looking for these positive deviants. They can leverage them and use them as unofficial demo hosts, but they can play an important role in scaling up or encouraging adoption of that technology. The selection of the demo location, again, here the criteria is determined by farmers for the most part, but there is a bias to try and pick sites by the roadside. Programs will require that the site take into account environmental protection, so they don't want a site where things like soil erosion will be increased. And in many cases, we found that this is clearly communicated, but it's tricky. It's tricky for programs because it needs to have a balance between picking demos by the roadside and also ensuring that the demos are accessible. So most of the vulnerable households may actually not have access to demos by the roadside. They may be in the interior. And I think the key thing here to remember is to not take for granted that there are farmers who are in areas within the interior who we may need to consider how they can access that demo. In terms of support structures for overseeing demos, generally there seems to be just a lack of adequate oversight. I think we had this from farmers, we had it from extension officers. People say that extension officers don't visit the demo enough and that affects the performance of the demo. A typical support structure, they'll have a technical manager, usually at the headquarters of that particular program, and then they will work with field officers who will then be supporting lead farmers. But across the board, we found that the lead farmers, support for lead farmers is not adequate, and the field officers are stretched. So this is something for implementers to keep an eye on, the ratio of demo sites and lead farmers that field officers are supporting, and make sure that we are not overloading the field officers and compromising the quality of the oversight provided for demos. In terms of technical guidance, again, they need to just make sure that the guidelines are documented. So what we found for the most part is people are doing training at the beginning of the season, but that training is mostly verbal. That training does not result in written guidelines or consistent guidelines. And I think what we really encourage implementers to do, to use that opportunity to develop their own guidelines together with stakeholders so that those guidelines are specific to that particular. So the second principle has to do with management of costs. Here we were interested in understanding the types of costs, how these costs are allocated, and how funds for support provided for demos are dispersed, and also how implementers are making sure that demos are cost effective. So this table here shows the costs that are involved in setting up demos. And there's two categories of costs. There's direct costs and then there's indirect costs. So direct costs are directly linked to setting up the demo. So you will need to provide seed, fertilizer, and other inputs. Most of the times there'll be need for a fence, for a signboard. For livestock demos, you'll need to have improved livestock breeds, housing, and animal fodder, aquaculture inputs as well, and then land and labor. And those direct inputs can either be monetary or non-monetary. So what we found is that farmers get support on monetary costs, and they provide most of the non-monetary costs. For example, land and labor are examples of things that are non-monetary that are being provided for by farmers. But by and large, farmers provide most of the costs. There are areas where implementers provide quite a bit of support. And implementers here, we mean NGOs, sometimes government as well. And then there's even fewer areas where private sector provides support. In terms of the indirect costs, we have staff salaries and technical support through public and private extension providers, and also the training costs associated with those demos. And those can be significant as well. So I think a recommendation here is to take into account how that's linked to the number of demos, and especially with the support staff and the number of visits that they need to make, provide oversight. So in terms of the way people come up with costs for demos, we found that cost information is not very specific at the design phase. It will vary over time, and this makes it really difficult for people to budget. Most programs seek to minimize the level of direct support provided. I think that's very common. But there are inconsistencies sometimes even in one area where different programs are working on the level of support. So just because you have your own approach doesn't mean that other implementers in the area are using that same formula, and that can make mixed messages as well. There's a tendency to assume that as we face down the level of support that's provided for demos, the private sector will absorb that cost, or that farmers will, or that the public extension system will. And in most cases, that they have very limited capacity. In terms of the mechanisms used to disperse funds, most implementers are not providing cash. What mostly happens is they provide the materials that are needed to set up the demos. But we also found that implementers are innovating, sometimes providing vouchers or working in arrangements with service providers or input providers, where the farmers are able to buy inputs using their own money and then get reimbursed once they prove that they've actually bought those. The timely delivery of inputs is a major challenge. A lot of times the inputs are not getting to farmers on time for them to be able to set up the demo appropriately. So the recommendations here is that there's need for budgeting tools to help implementers deal with the issue of planning, and also for flexibility in budgeting, and those are things that we will address in the publication. The disbursement using vouchers and reimbursement can be used to get around this issue of late delivery of inputs. I think it's something that should be encouraged. So principle number 3 looks at stakeholder engagement, and here we are interested in understanding who are the stakeholders involved, what are their roles, interests, and capacity, and what are the coordination mechanisms. So this table here, I won't go into detail, but what it shows is an exercise that we went through in each of the countries, which is identifying who are the stakeholders, so from implementers, researchers, government, all the way to local leadership, and farmers, and farmer groups. So you'll find that there's a wide, broad spectrum of stakeholders involved. They have different interests, and their roles differ. What's important is to make sure that there's alignment between their interests, the role that they play, and the capacity that they have. So in the stakeholder workshops that we did in each of the countries, this was an interesting exercise for them as they would see what role they play and who they need to work with and who they can rely on. The capacity shown on your right, the ones highlighted in bold, resources or assets that those particular stakeholders have strength in. They may have other capacities as well, but the ones in bold are the ones that are strong. So coordination mechanisms, we did find that there are very few instances where MOUs are used to govern the relationship between the program and private sector. I think with research institutions, it's a bit more common, but MOUs have a certain value in terms of understanding, helping people understand the role, and also spelling out coordination mechanisms. We did find, however, that farmer field days are the main mode of interaction, so that's the way that stakeholders get together to talk about the demonstration site. There are some coordination committees, but mainly these bring development partners, so it will mainly be NGOs working with government, and private sector don't participate as much. Implementers are sharing reports about demos. The feedback loops are not necessarily functioning that well. We did find that there's a lot of dialogue happening once the reports are shared about how the demos are performing and what adjustments need to be made. And again, I did mention that signboards are used as a way to disseminate information regarding partnership, as a way of recognizing who's contributing to that effort. So recommendations for strengthening stakeholder engagement. There's need to be more systematic in doing the stakeholder mapping exercise, understanding the roles, understanding the alignment of capacity and interest. In the 3 countries, we found that implementers and even government, private sector really appreciated that kind of opportunity. So it's something that we encourage implementers to do more of, even during implementation. Important to pay attention to power dynamics. We see that farmers play an important role in setting up these demos and in the success of these demos, and they don't always have as much say. So how do you bring in the voice of farmers in the stakeholder platforms would be important. MOUs are important. I think where possible, we would encourage implementers to explore those because they do help people understand what the partnership, how the partnership is going to be managed, how issues when they come up are going to be addressed. An example is delays in delivery of inputs. If an MOU talks about risk management and ways for stakeholders to come together on a regular basis and review and make recommendations on how they can improve the management, establishment of demos in subsequent seasons, that is really helpful. And then there's need for appreciation of informal private sector. We found that whether it's village agents or local service providers, they are playing an important role in engaging with farmers and in encouraging interest in improved farming practices and technologies, but they don't always come to the table. So that's something else for implementers to pay attention to. So I will now hand over to Claire to take us through the other principles, or maybe we can do a few questions. We have. Yeah.
We haven't got any online. Does anyone in the room have questions on principles 1 through 3?
Sure. Just a few. It's very comprehensive. Thank you for a thorough and I love the attention being given to farmers for a change. I was curious whether or not you observed, you were in the teams, were there any differences in these findings between gender, having women's demonstration slots versus men or mixed, because of the access issues. You made a lot of references to input service providers at the time of arrival. That kind of, I was curious whether there might be some differences between individual farmers who might struggle with that versus producer association, where you have more of an apex structure in place that interacts with the marketplace, so that you could come down very hard, or it's more alluring and more attractive for buyers and suppliers to want to furnish a large quantity, small quantity. So you might be able to avoid that. So I was curious about that. So yeah, let's stop.
Yeah, I would say in terms of gender, we will have a principle addressing gender and inclusion. So maybe we can save that discussion and let that pass. But in terms of differences between individual farmers and farmers who are in groups, you know, for the most part, I feel like most food security programs with each other are working with so far. So the level of organization of those farmers, how formal those groups are, from producer groups to like associations, really varies. We don't find a lot of food security programs work with huge enough associations that create a kind of economies of scale that would really draw in private sector. But I think in Zimbabwe there were examples of seed companies really being interested in coming to set up demos where they understand that the user groups, there's a network of those kind of user groups. So if they feel like they can reach 100, 200 farmers, they're more willing to provide support for those kinds of demos. But yeah, it was interesting to look at individual farmers and the access that they have for input and see whether that varies. They're not part of it.
Yeah, I think what I've found, my experience has been when you come in with a program and you know you can guarantee you're going to have 5 years of funding for a certain area, then you get the attention of input suppliers. They know that there's a structure in place that some level of oversight is there.
So that's good. Okay. I think we hand over to Claire for now, and then we can do more Q&A again.
Hi, can everyone hear me? All right, great. So I'm going to start, as Gatau said.
Yes, and Claire, if you can start maybe by just introducing yourself.
Sure. So my name's Claire Sullivan, and I'm the Deputy Research Director at the Agriculture and Food Security Center at Columbia University, and I'm working on World Vision for this project since late fall. So I'm going to start, as Gatau said, by talking about our last 4 guiding principles, and I'll start with information management. So in this case, we wanted to understand what kinds of data are projects collecting, how are they collecting this data, and then, most importantly, how is this data being utilized? And in terms of utilization, the kind of primary things we were looking at was, are they using data just to monitor, to think about it as a process for stakeholders to assess a project's progress towards goals and objectives, and then kind of on a more nuanced scale to use that understanding of processes and progress and to take those learning and incorporate it back into program planning in terms of adaptive management. And this is kind of the typical flow of information management that we saw in most programs. So a farmer with a demo or a lead farmer supervising a group of farmers with smaller demonstrations would gather just very basic agronomic information. Maybe they'd estimate yields by volume, they'd say when they planted, if they applied fertilizer. That would get written in a notebook or a record that had been provided by the project. Then when the next time the extension agent comes, they might discuss that record with the farmer. The extension agent might record that in a more formal template, bring that back to their manager, and that might get incorporated into some kind of project reporting. Perhaps it also goes back into program planning. We did see some variability in this. These are some examples of the types of data that we saw collected. So we can group this into 4 broad categories. We have project management data. The extension agent might collect the number of farmers they're working with, the number of demos, the attendance at trainings or meetings, farmers, the frequency that they're visiting farmers and demos. We saw a little bit of environmental data, things like rainfall, incidents of major shocks, climate shocks like a flood or a drought, soil health. This was our most common types of data, basic agronomic information, and then some performance indicators like the profitability or the acceptability of a practice, whether that the production from the demo is being used for home consumption or sales, and whether there's evidence of farmer learning, changes in adoption, or changes in demand for input. And in terms of how frequently those different indicators are collected, it's really primarily agronomic data. On a number of projects report that they're collecting revenue, some basic attendance and participation metrics. Much less common are what we saw as pretty important indicators, such as the acceptability of the practice and farmer learning, something that would give you a more nuanced understanding of the practice, like labor, and then quite rare but interesting indicators with things like household consumption, changes in demand, or adoption rates. This is an example of a typical record that's kept. This was from a group in Bangladesh. In terms of how is this data being collected, the format is often these kind of ad hoc registers collected by farmers. Sometimes you will see farmers using standardized templates. In this case, you can see that this is a pretty organized record. Sometimes you see like little strips of paper where the farmer's just recording one thing and then it's later being structured. In this case, the farmer has several different treatments and is recording separate data in a pretty organized fashion for each of those different practices on the plot. We did see some utilization of mobile data collection tools like Open Data Kit. That was not common. More common is that farmers might take photos of a demo that's having an issue, send that to their extension agent for feedback, or there was some use of Facebook groups for communication. The frequency of this collection varies really widely across projects. We saw projects collecting data on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, or perhaps even just once or twice a season. The typical actors doing this data collection are the farmers and agricultural extension agents. In the case, as Gitao mentioned, of trials, there's some kind of blurring between whether trials or demonstrations. In that case, you might have more of a scientist involved. And often this is done with very little equipment. A few projects are providing things like weigh scales, GPS, smartphones, or measuring tape, but frequently this is a very low-tech process. And then most importantly, we were wondering, how is this data being used? So in the case of farmer learning, this data is being used both to share outcomes of the demonstration That might be through meetings, trainings, farmer field school, or farmer field days. Sometimes it's just through a signboard. Projects are using videos, dramas, radios, guided tours. Sometimes this data is just being used to get advice on an issue in the demo plot. And so we wanted to make the distinction here. While the information that the project's collecting might not make it up to the project office to be kind of formally gathered and integrated to look at broader trends, it frequently is going back to the farmers to help them kind of digest and process and learn about the demonstration and the different practices on it. It's also often being used for project reporting. That's pretty straightforward. A few indicators might be collected from the project that'll feed back to the project office, maybe be owners or to regional management. And then in terms of getting to that last step of adaptive management, what I have here is kind of a basic model of adaptive management, and that's a structured decision-making process that allows for flexibility in planning and adjustment of activities as you better understand your system's outcomes. And we do find that some projects are doing this. Here's a case from Bangladesh, and this is a program that reports that they organize their data on a monthly basis. They look at the trends, they evaluate whether there's any issues, and then they try to adjust. At an annual basis, as they prepare to do their planning for the next year, they're integrating all that data again, evaluating what works, and then setting their plan for the upcoming year. That's a relatively structured process. Typically, what was reported by projects was much more ad hoc, that they would encounter a significant constraint. They would hear that from the farmer group agents. They would consider how to address that problem, and they might, if they could, if they had the flexibility of the budget, they might make an adjustment. So in terms of recommendations or on information management, we did find that while projects are collecting data, that collection is not consistent, and it's frequently not adequate. So we often really struggled in our key informant interviews to get even very basic information about a project, such as how many demonstrations they had and what types of demonstrations were they doing, and then how many farmers that were they reaching with those. So there are a lot of good standard form collection. It is a big effort, but we would recommend that farmers collect, or that projects collect in a standardized format basic data about project activities, and then ensure that that data is compiled and shared in a meaningful form with key stakeholders, and most importantly, farmers. So there's a lot of information in a demonstration to unpack, and in order to make that assessment with farmers, it has to go beyond just these basic agronomics, so that farmers have a better understanding about the broader trade-off in terms of the acceptability of the practice to different labor inputs, and then that maybe potential marginal increase. And there's a lot of new ICT tools out there that maybe aren't widely accessible to everyone, but have the potential in the near future to be an opportunity to facilitate different data collection. All right, so our fifth guiding principle is risk management. And as Gautam mentioned, demo plots are inherently a risk management strategy. So they allow farmers to try out a new idea on a small piece of land, to adapt that idea to the local context and evaluate how it works before applying it to a larger area of their field, or if they're participating in a farmer group with a lead farmer, to evaluate that practice on someone else's field before applying it on their own. And in the case of where farming is always a risky endeavor, and in the context of food security programs, even more so. The populations that are likely to be targeted are often in very marginal environments and vulnerable to shock. So many of the many of the practices themselves are intended to increase the resilience of the system and its adaptability to these kind of shocks. So in our interviews, we heard, as Gatel mentioned, many constraints. And I think the most common constraint reported by implementers and farmers were related to climate and the environment. So we heard about major climate risks like floods and droughts, the later early onset of rain, pest and disease, damage from livestock. And we saw a lot of strategies that projects were doing to mitigate these risks. They might compensate farmers for the failure of a demo. Projects often have many, many demos to kind of capture, so there'll be some success and to understand the variability of that practice's performance across the community. And these failures can also be an opportunity for learning, for understanding better how to adapt the practice to the local context. In terms of reducing risk, we see lots of products promoting drought-resilient varieties. The small size of the demo, or making sure a demo is a small size relative to the total farm size, is important, and then a good assessment of those risks in advance. And the other primary constraint was behavior change constraints. Projects talked about financial constraints, as Tom mentioned, of farmers to actually upscale or to actually adopt that practice, farmers' failure to follow the guidelines and protocols for the practice, farmers being averse to adopting new practices, and then selection of appropriate participants for the project. So good criteria for selecting participants and selecting lead farmers, practice selection, supportive financial programs, and then training and monitoring are ways to reduce that risk. The other primary category is these institutional constraints, and that's referring to the delivery of programs, the kind of philosophies behind programs, and then the actual just operations and processes that implementing organizations are using. And the constraints that we saw related to that were largely about the quality of inputs, the timing of the delivery of these inputs, and then the adequacy of well-trained staff and their availability for farmers in the case of farmers encountered problems with the demo. So ways to reduce that risk are evaluating your supply chain early and ensuring you have financing on time, training village agents, setting feasible targets and activity plans, and then providing adequate training to staff. So our kind of overall recommendation in terms of risk management is that we've seen that DFAPs have really good tools to look at risk, potential shock, stresses, and vulnerable groups at the onset, at the community level, and then develop kind of viable action plans for that. But we're not seeing that these kind of assessment tools are scaled down well for individual activities like demo plot programs. So our guiding principle number 6 is social exclusion and gender integration. There's a good understanding that food security programs need to integrate women and most marginal groups and communities in order to make their larger goals of livelihood improvements. We know that gender empowerment in agriculture is one of the pathways to link agriculture, food security, nutrition, and women are important players in agricultural activities. However, we did not find that there's much of an effort in projects to include most marginalized groups in demo plot programs in particular. In the few cases that we saw that these groups were included, they were usually targeted from the very beginning, and they're very specific types of projects. Many projects aren't addressing that at all, beyond it in saying that they work with largely vulnerable populations of smallholder farmers. For the case of gender, that's very different. We do see that women are often the primary beneficiaries and are included in most projects. And the way to do either of have inclusivity as a goal in general is to address constraints for both of these populations early on and to really understand their needs so that they can be involved. So we saw that projects are using sensitization tools for gender in addition to their demo plot programs. There's looking at activities like aquaculture, home gardens, fruit drying, poultry keeping that women in the projects had identified as a priority for them and feasible for them. We did see examples of projects trying to address major barriers like access to land and assets, and that was a successful way for them to make sure that women could be involved. So our recommendations would be that as part of project design, you need to do an assessment very early on to identify these groups in the community, to really use gender as a lens for understanding the implementation demonstration plot. You need to ask what the priorities, needs, and barriers are for these groups. And that needs to be something that happens throughout the project because these can be fluid things. And so the assessment should be done regularly, and then there should be follow-ups of sensitizations or trainings if they're needed. And also hiring, or supporting female project staff or extension officers. We found a shortage of female officers in many of the projects that we visited. So our last principle is sustainability. Gitao mentioned this is one of the primary concerns for demo plot programs, and there's really a lack of clarity about what sustainability means in a demonstration plot. It's determined by the project goals and outcomes, and we saw a couple possible definitions for what sustainability is in a demonstration plot. So it could be that the demonstration site itself continues after the phase out of the project and farmers are able to continue to experiment and evaluate practices. It could be that farmers are actually adopting the practice or the varieties promoted in the demonstration, but the demo itself does not need to continue after the project is phased out. Or it could be that farmers have a new ability to and a new understanding of how to experiment with new technologies and practices, and they can use not a project-based demo, but a sort of adaptation of demos on their farm to continue to experiment and learn with new practices in a way that mitigates, that reduces risk for them. And we saw lots of projects handling this in a different way, probably based on these widely different definitions of what sustainability is. So some projects employ fee-based models, like an annual fee or a user fee to kind of continue to fund extension support programs. Projects partner with government extension or the private sector and train and build capacity in these groups, as they don't have project-based incentives, and so they might continue to be there after the project is phased out. And then projects are increasing the awareness on technologies and practices through outreach to build capacity in the community itself. And our recommendations on sustainability are that from the beginning, a project really think about what sustainability for demonstrations will mean in their project, and then identify options based on that. And also that projects use this collaborative learning and adapting approach by USAID to build capacity for learning, knowledge management, and problem solving. And that projects really foster these linkages with these stakeholders that Gitao mentioned earlier to ensure that there's service providers and there's access to the technology. So I think we're ready to start our second piece, which is our group exercise. So what we're going to do is we're going to have an opportunity to kind of digest what we discussed and to get some feedback from our participants about whether you think these recommendations could be applied in your programs, and then also to discuss some of the gaps and relevant issues that we might have missed. And we're going to split into two groups, with one discussion happening online and then one discussion happening in person.
useful. And again, it's just a reflection of the programs that that have demonstration sites, thinking about their needs, trying to see how some of these recommendations those needs, or are there any issues that you've come across? Guidelines. Floor is open.
I have a question first, if I could. I'm struggling a little bit because I think one of the things you said at the outset was that an important characteristic of a demonstration plot is that it's actually demonstrating that has been proven to be effective previously. And so really the objective is to help people understand how to adopt that practice that's being demonstrated over practices. But at the same time, there was a lot of reference to research and experimentation on demonstration plots. So I'm trying to understand the extent to which are we actually using demonstration plots to test and experiment, or are they demonstrating things that have been proven to be effective and that we're communicating to learn, or is that not a distinction really in its both?
I think
Hi everyone, can you hear me? This is Abby.
I can hear again.
Great. Hi Claire. Great. So everyone should have the ability to use your microphone if you want to speak. We are going to pass it over to Claire to facilitate. This is just the people online. The people in person are having their own discussion, and so this is just everyone that is online to answer these few group questions. So how can the recommendations be applied in your programs, and then are there any gaps or relevant issues that the study group missed? So Claire, I'm going to pass it over to you, and then anyone else who is joining us online, feel free to chime in as you wish.
Right, so
Hi, everyone. So we just wanted to, get a sense of the applicability of some of these recommendations for the projects that you work on. And then, really to kind of, we talked obviously to lots of projects, and we did these in-depth case studies, but we wanted some feedback on whether you think these are, we've covered all the relevant issues, because there's a huge variation in the ways projects are implementing demos and the types of demos and the objectives of those demonstrations and the objectives of those programs. So kind of curious to hear from people whether we think we covered the major issues that you've encountered in your project. And people can either use your microphone, or if you want to type questions, we can all see them, or comments. And I'll take notes,
Claire, I have
on this session, and then we can share. Oh, go ahead.
Hi Claire, this is Abby. I was wondering if there were any kind of star demonstration site projects that you came across that you felt like met a lot of these guiding principles, or that were really just hitting the mark, that you felt like other organizations should know about so that they can try and replicate, or do you feel like it's so context specific that there isn't really one model that works in multiple locations?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. One of the things that we're hoping to do is kind of highlight, and we haven't quite gotten to this, but our next step will be to highlight like 2 or 3 I think maybe we'll be at actually 3 to 4 different really model projects as case studies and sort of show how they implement some of these, how we see them implementing some of these principles that we've outlined. And I think there's some variation, and that's why we want to cover a couple different projects, as we've seen some really good examples where projects are training, working with agro-input dealers, training them, encouraging them to set up demos, kind of strengthening that sort of the village agent, private sector approach. And I think that can work really well. Seems like it works especially well for more commodity-based crops like maize or rice. That's what we saw in Bangladesh and Zimbabwe. And then, kind of on the other end of the spectrum, we saw a couple of projects in Bangladesh that were working on these like complex integrated like home gardens with rainwater harvesting and these that they call these climate resilient practices. And those are being done, right on farm with like structure crops. So we saw a couple projects doing similar things. One was the Krell project that Meryl mentioned, and then another was run by Shushalan, who's going to be one of the primary implementers on World Vision's Nobu Jatra project there. Specific piece which we talked about a lot and that Meryl's mentioning here is that's really critical. It seems that successful projects are really localizing their implementation practice and the practices that they're promoting to that region and really to that community. And that's so projects are struggling because it takes a huge amount of time to do that and to do it well, and so it's a big, it requires a lot of upfront investment. And I think another thing that it also speaks to why there's a lack of good guidelines, because the guidelines tend to be very general because the demonstration itself and the demonstration project really need to be adapted. And I don't know if Shadrach, you're still on the line, but Shadrach was on our field team in Niger and Zimbabwe, and he may have another great case study to highlight.
Claire, this is Abby again. On the sustainability piece, I know, beyond just demonstration sites, the DFAP world in general, there's a lot of talk about, after the program ends, how do we go back and check what has worked or hasn't and what has been sustained? Did you come across any programs who had gone back to check their demonstration sites post-program ending, or maybe continued on with a new program in the same area and were able to kind of see whether or not the demonstration sites were in fact sustained over time?
We did see examples of that. I think that's a really good question. And I think, again, that it's something, as I was saying earlier about project timelines, it's really hard for projects to do that. So in the cases that we found projects doing that, it was often the organization, the implementing organization, that had decided to invest separate to be able to do that, because that was kind of beyond the project cycle. So right now, off the top of my head, I cannot remember who it was that had done that, but we found two examples of institutions that had gone to look at uptake of practices. I think it was about 5 years after projects had happened. And this, we didn't talk a lot about adoption, but I think it's an issue to consider, because we know that farmers are they might be testing out a practice, and you might see the uptake of that practice during the project cycle, but whether are farmers still interested in it? Do they still see that it has value and that they want to keep doing it after, say, 4 or 5 years? It's a really important question to ask, whether that's happening, and especially for practices that might have more advantages or require a lot of time for the farmers to really see the benefit of that practice. Maybe it's very different for an annual crop with like a mineral fertilizer input, but if you're looking at like perennials, or if you're looking at more landscape restoration, you're really not going to see a benefit in the short term. And so I think that was very valuable for projects to go back and do that, but they did have to make that investment as an organization, and they did it actually outside of their project funding in both cases. Yes, I see a question about the budget and cost recommendation. Part of what we'll do as we're putting the guidebook together is we'll put together a budgeting tool that can be used for demonstration sites. And it'll, have to be adapted, but we're putting one together that we recommend, and then we're also we'll point users to other available resources. There's actually very little available for budgeting, but we're doing something similar for the information management, and in that case, there's quite a few other resources available. Many of the projects that we spoke with mentioned that was a real need for them, is to have a budgeting tool, and they were even within their program creating their own tool. Yeah, so I think the question about ICT is also really interesting. I found some of the most valuable uses of ICT were not so much for project reporting, but was more to facilitate the interaction between the farmer and the extension agent, and maybe farmer to extension agent up to some of the cases that we thought used was with like national research institutes where they had new varieties to promote and expensive demonstration programs. And it seems like ICT has big potential to make that kind of communication easier. So we all know that these extension agents have these huge catchments, so many farmers, so many demonstration plots to visit. And they often have, very limited funds for actually traveling. The distances might be big. And so it seems like ICT, the biggest potential is just in making it easier for that communication to happen. I think very limited case is that it's used for data collection. We saw just a couple projects that were using mobile data for that. As Meryl's mentioning, these low-cost videos, we saw a lot of use of video, and we saw also drama as a similar thing, but without the ICT component, that both seem to be very successful. You're mentioning the Digital Green specifically. We saw, I think, one project that Digital Green was working on, and we now see a number of projects that are using some of their examples and training materials to do that on their own. And it does seem to be really popular with farmers.
Can you hear me?
And that's
Adrian, can you hear me? This is Meryl.
Hi, Meryl. Yes.
Hey. Yeah, so so the New Alliance ICT project is actually, the purpose is to scale up seed technologies that this, their sort of parallel initiative is doing, the Scaling Seeds and Technologies Partnership. So Digital Green actually is what I was referring to in Ethiopia, and it's been really successful. I mean, they record the videos out in the field with a local farmer, and then they take little pico projectors to farmer groups, and they basically hold discussions, and they view the video together. It was really neat. I got to go out last year actually and see it in the field in person, and the farmers responded really well. And the great thing about it was that there were I'm trying to think of there were maybe like 1/4 of the farmers there were women, which was very encouraging as well, because gender integration is something that we are trying to do also with that project. But our role, IBTCI's role, is to be the learning contractor and the monitoring contractor. So we deal with the data and collecting lessons learned. Yeah, really successful.
Hi, Seth. Yeah, so in every, I think we're going to join back in a moment, but in every site, in each of our case studies in particular, we were able to meet with a lot of government and research institutions, and they are often, one of the major groups that is implementing demos. And I think if you look at some of the tables in particular, the National Research Institutes are doing huge numbers of demos. Sometimes those are a little more focused on improved seed varieties. So I would say the objectives are a little different.
Mm-hmm. How much of the time is spent with these demos that you observed on the theory versus practice? I think most of the emphasis you've given us has been on the practice. Fine, but seeing is believing. They work with their hands. Like. So was there any of these demo plots that had classroom time? The ones that you've observed? I mean, it could be shade tree, outdoor classroom.
Right.
In the loop.
No, I would say almost all demo site hosts have attended something. And there's an expectation that they are also cascading that training. So yeah, you will find conservation agriculture manual for that. You mentioned about the literacy levels, and I think just a different way of learning, different way of reviewing data. So even when farmers are not collecting all these, keeping all the records, I think what's important is that they're having a dialogue to reflect what are we learning. And I think in Bangladesh, we found that they do learning caravans, where at the end of the season, they go around encouraging farmers to have discussions, what came out of the summer skills school, and to encourage other stakeholders to come in.
This is the implementer, or who's doing the character?
It's a local NGO in Bangladesh. That's what such a potential activity in the program. But yeah, I think there's a lot of training that happens for the lead farmers, perhaps not as much support for the lead farmers to train other farmers. I think that's where now the quality of learning kind of takes
a hit. Yeah, the whole cascading, I'm not against the idea and the concept because it's so cost efficient. However, every layer you go down, you lose quality, every level. You start here with the guy with the master's degree from the agronomic university, then you go to someone who's got all the good intent, and you may get it naturally, understand, you know how to grow food, they'll survive out there where you and I would, and then you go below that, and you get someone with a lot of enthusiasm, you know, but you keep, and that applies to any of the sectors we covered, you know. But I don't know, I really haven't come up with a solution for that.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Even we found that as you go to that lower level, there's a lot of misconceptions. And you'd be amazed how much misconceptions drive adoption. So in Zimbabwe, they are trying to promote growing of small grains like sorghum and millet. They are more drought hardy and climate change adaptation strategies.
Mm-hmm.
But their communities and people who believe that sorghum and millet are not we, this community here grow, and that's a sign that we are embracing rough times. This is something that we only used to do when there was drought, but now an idea of them being advanced, more developed, maize, more than crops. Right, exactly. And so that those kind of notions affect the training and how people take these ideas and how people do the demonstration side. So we are finding that it's more and more important to pay attention to kind of be aware and address that potential.
So in the interest of time, we have about 5 minutes left. And was there anything from the in-person discussion that you guys wanted to make sure the folks online heard about? Okay, if not, but.
Yeah, no, I think there was good questions raised, good comments provided. Again, this was an important step for us to get these questions, these ideas. So we've gotten ideas, especially about even prioritizing the recommendations. That will be very, very important. You know, there are issues even about considering the literacy levels of the target groups, seeing what kind of recommendations we make about record keeping, recommendations around engagement of government, government institutions, and what kind of capacity should be bringing up. So I think we've gotten some really, really good feedback. What we hope to do, take all this feedback, use it to update the publication, and we're hoping it will give an opportunity also for publication. It's going to be a living document, and when we do send it around, if people have feedback, we want to have opportunity that part of that.
Yeah.
The layout now.
Are you going to send it around to the attendees? Just I'm just curious.
To which the publication? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if we're on that list, we'll...
Exactly, yeah. So sign up, and we'll make sure we send you a copy of the publication. And if within your organization you'd like to have a discussion about it, we're hoping to have a forum where we can see some demos. They're important. Sometimes we take them for granted, but that's more.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Claire for joining us online and for Gitao. This work is really interesting and very thorough. We really appreciate all of the recommendations and the hard work that went into this. As well as the data team, I know we have Shadrach online. We have Shadi in person. Thanks so much for all of the hard work that went into this. And Adrian for helping support online, and Katie for helping bring us snacks in person. Thanks everyone that joined us online and in person. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.